Hi, welcome to another vinyl thing. Today I'm going to be looking at the entire back catalogue of 8 studio albums by one of the most exciting bands to come out of the UK, who don't get nearly as much love as they deserve. I'm talking about Roxy Music. Over 8 studio albums. They totally redesigned their own sound and influenced hundreds of other sounds and bands that would come later. I'm going to be looking through these 8 albums, my impressions of them, and which albums I believe you should start with if you're new to Roxy Music. So I hope you enjoy this video. Go grab yourself a brew, strap in, and here we go. 8 amazing studio albums by Roxy Music. And we start off with the band's debut album called Roxy Music from 1972. The son of a Geordie docker manages to transform himself into the quintessential modern European crooner, whilst combining a music that is equal parts classy, smooth, alien and edgy. And that sound, equal parts sexy, funky, edgy and raw. It's rare for a band to get it right on their very first album, but on Roxy Music's eponymous debut outing, they created something so unique and diverse, so captivating and strange, that it's still held up as one of the most defining moments nearly 50 years later. The band arrived to the listening public in 1972 looking and sounded like they'd just stepped off another planet. The songs were a perfect contrast of the highest sophistication and the rawest energy of a seedy backstreet club. They were fresh, new, inventive, and signalled a shift from the disillusioned end of the hippie era into a promising new science fiction future. Even today, the sound of Roxy Music's first album demands your attention and remains one of their greatest achievements. And my favourite track from their first album is 2HB, so check that out if you get a chance. Next up, we have 1973's For Your Pleasure, possibly their darkest, most decadent, nihilistic, experimental album. Still incredible to listen to today, and my favourite track from that is the title track, For Your Pleasure. Then coming out in the same year, 1973, we have the third album, Stranded. When asked years later, Brian Eno actually referred to Stranded as his favourite Roxy Music album, which is extremely kind of him considering it was the first the band had released after his departure. Brian's really coming into his own as a lyricist on their third album, and the band have definitely found their feet from the experimental beginnings of their first 2 albums into something more solid and perfected on their third. The songs are consistently strong, but still continue to evolve the band sonically. And my favourite track from that album is A Song for Europe. Then in 1974, dodgy cover notwithstanding, Roxy Music really settled into their groove on these 2 albums, Stranded, that I just mentioned, and Country Life, honing the more unpredictable elements of their first 2 albums and finding what sounds define them. The worst I can say about Country Life is that it's not as mind-blowing as some of the other albums that they did, but when the albums are as good as this, that's no great insult. Country Life is a solid album of interesting songs, including possibly my all-time favourite song of theirs, Out of the Blue, which features the stumbling drum riff of the brilliant Paul Thompson and the soaring processed oboe of Andy McKay. It also features bona fide standout Roxy classics like Bittersweet and The Thrill of It All. And my favourite track off this album is, of course, Out of the Blue. Then in 1975 we have Siren. I love all of Roxy Music's albums, but they made such a big change from their more experimental, raw punk glam beginnings to their ethereal, funky end that it can be difficult for new fans to understand where to start. And Siren, in my opinion at least, is the perfect bridge album in their collection. Probably the most all-encompassing bringing in of the art, punk, glam, rock, experimentation elements of their early albums and the sexy, sleek sound of their later albums. To this end, I'd probably recommend it to anyone who wants a kind of overall Roxy experience. And my favourite track on this album is the quintessential Love is the Drug. 1979's Manifesto next, Roxys Return after a 4-year recording hiatus, which saw them on uncertain ground, flirting with punk rock, disco and new wave. It's often seen as one of their poorer albums creatively, lacking some of the more poetic leanings of the first few albums. But that said, I do believe that this is a much underrated album and shows a great deal of continued experimentation and further capability of the band to grow in different directions. A lesson in band synergy. Every band member is bringing all they've got here, and it's much more than just the Ferry show. Great stuff. The opening title track in itself is a masterpiece of Ferry's dark psyche. Following on from that is the fun of pop-punk song Trash, and then the groove of disco-laced tracks like Angel Eyes, which are unforgettable, even to the most cynical critic. One of Roxy's more underrated albums, this one, and my favourite track would be the album version of Angel Eyes. 1980's Flesh and Blood is possibly their worst album, but still definitely worth checking out. Brian was always the main driving force of Roxy Music, but as with any great band, the other members all took the music in different directions and added their own unique ingredient to the overall sound. 1980's Flesh and Blood is perhaps the only exception to this, with sounding much more like a Brian Ferry solo album, with perhaps the edge of the rest of the band's output. Added to this are two really rather lackluster cover versions, In the Midnight Hour by Wilson Pickett and 8 Miles High from the Byrds, both of which are disappointing and add nothing to the originals or to the album. That said, however, Flesh and Blood is still an enjoyable album with great pop mastery being shown on songs like Same Old Scene, which could easily have been written some 5 years later by Duran Duran, for example, and Over You, amongst others. It's a really enjoyable album, but perhaps less groundbreaking than some of their others, and my favourite track on that album is Same Old Scene. And last but certainly not least, in 1982 they finished off with Avalon. Whilst lyrically Avalon isn't the best of Roxy's albums, the whole experience is what levitates their last work slightly above the rest of their catalogue for me. Like the best albums, Avalon takes you on a journey. It's a place to visit, and it's the most beautiful, ethereal place that you could imagine. My favourite track from Avalon is While My Heart Is Still Beating. And that rounds off the 8 studio albums of Roxy Music. Back to me. So many thanks for tuning in and watching that. There was a lot of firsts on this video. First time I'd used this camera, which is a Lumix GH2. Which I did a previous video about, which I'm going to try and put a link to up here. First time I tried overdubbing with my Blue Yeti microphone, and first time I've tried to combine the two using what little software I've got on my PC. So I hope all this works. I hope it's not too jarring, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If you'd like to see more of this kind of video talking about music and vinyl and albums and all sorts of things like that, then please do like, subscribe and comment below, and thanks very much for watching.